Josh Shapiro is the governor of Pennsylvania. I just wrote an op-ed in Newsweek about why I think he should be the VP pick. It's not to say that there aren't any other people that are good. Tim Walz is a fantastic governor out of Minnesota. I'd be very happy with either one of those picks. But I like Shapiro because he's challenged corporations and corporate power before, and not a lot of people know about it, and that's part of what was driving me crazy, and I wanted to basically set the record straight. Jordan Ewell, one of our hosts here, is going to push back and disagree with me here after I lay out my case a little bit. So real quick, let me tell you things you might not know about Governor Shapiro, and then we'll discuss. So I wrote, Wall Street banks make an intense amount of money by running the pension funds in many different states. They view the state employees who run those funds as suckers and charge exorbitant fees for mediocre results. Shapiro put an end to that when he was the chairman of the Montgomery County Board of Commissioners. He also took on predatory lenders when he was Attorney General of Pennsylvania. Those lenders were the subsidiary of an enormous private equity company, Warburg Pincus. So look, I want to pause there to say, guys, Walz, who has also done this in his own way in Minnesota, and Shapiro, who did it in Pennsylvania, are unicorns. This type of stuff never happens. It's there, obviously, happens 0% of the time in the Republican Party, but almost never in the Democratic Party. So when I saw his record throughout all these years, and actually, if you watch a lot of Young Turks clips throughout the years, you'll see me complimenting Josh Shapiro years ago, because I saw these things. So he's taken on an $82 billion private equity company and saying, I think you're predatory and you're ripping off the citizens of Pennsylvania, and I'm not gonna stand for it. Usually Democrats never endanger their own corporate donors like that. Then you might not be able to get money from Wall Street. He took on Wall Street twice, kicking them off the pensions when he was on the chairman of the Montgomery County Commission was amazing. Saved a lot of money for the good residents of Pennsylvania. Now, a lot of people have concerns about his record on Israel, so I want to address that, and then I'll bring Jordan in and we'll talk about the rest. I say his position on Israel is correct, though his optics are terrible. Like all sane people, Shapiro supports a two-state solution and a free, independent Palestine. As for his support of Israel, consider his remarks about its leader. He, quote, I personally believe Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the worst leaders of all time, Shapiro said in January, months before Chuck Schumer came out against Netanyahu. I couldn't agree more, and Shapiro was ahead of the curve in pointing this out. That was also about the same time Bernie Sanders was still calling for, quote, a humanitarian pause in Gaza instead of a ceasefire. It took 3 more months for Senator Sanders to call Netanyahu an awful, awful leader. When did Shapiro first call Netanyahu a, quote, a terrible leader? Back in November of last year, well before almost any other major politician. So I've got more, but let me pause there. So Jordan, you tell me, what's wrong with this argument?
I don't know if there's anything, well, I guess there's a couple ways of looking at it, right? So you frame this as the progressive choice. You think Shapiro is the progressive choice, but even in your setup and in that piece, you made one fleeting mention of Walz, but in this setup here, you continually mention Walz. So I guess I'm wondering, I don't see this as much as like an argument, as more like how do you make this case that this is the progressive choice when you can say both of these potential picks have done this, but this guy is the progressive choice. Why not Walz? When Walz has called for a ceasefire where Shapiro hasn't. Shapiro has conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, something that you have pointed out on the show as damaging to the cause and unfair, and he's been called out by the ACLU for it. So how is this the progressive choice when issues that I've seen you rail against are pretty big red flags coming from Shapiro?
Yeah, so a couple of things here. This is not Shapiro versus Walz. And so remember, we're not even talking about our most ideal choice, right? Bernie Sanders is off the board because we're never gonna consider him. My first choice was Jamie Raskin, who's been terrific on a lot of fronts. Real progressive, came out against what Israel was doing, called for a ceasefire a long time ago, et cetera, right? But we're down to the contenders now. So I'm not here to debate that Tim Walz is a bad guy or not. Absolutely not. Tim Walz is perfectly fine, perfectly good. And if you say, hey, I like him as a progressive a little bit more than Shapiro, I'm okay with that. I'm not. Look, I know that Tim Walz has also done some conservative things in Minnesota, but No, I'm not a perfectionist. That's exactly what I'm saying about Shapiro. He did some conservative things too. Now he's talking about a corporate tax cut in Pennsylvania. I hate that. Talks about school vouchers. I don't like that. That's not a progressive position. But Tim Walz has similar positions like that, but has passed a number of great bills that are very progressive on social and economic issues. Basically, what I'm doing here, Jordan, is two things. Number one, the reason I wrote this is because I only write op-eds when I feel like everybody's getting it wrong. So I wrote one for Newsweek about 10 months ago saying Joe Biden should drop out. He's obviously going to lose. And the reason I wrote that was because I was so frustrated that they couldn't see, of course he's gonna lose. Look at his approval numbers, look at the underlying numbers, look at his age, etc. And here Shapiro is being painted as some sort of conservative Democrat. And conservative Democrats and corporate Democrats do not take on corporate power. They never do that. And he's also done other terrific things. He took on the Catholic clergy, which was brave and saved a lot of kids. 300 pedophile priests outed. He's increased the budget in Pennsylvania. The Republicans hate him for it. And he won't back down from it. So this is not a Walz versus Shapiro. This is, Shapiro is greatly misunderstood, and the idea that he is, conservative or strictly corporatist or any of those things is not correct. And in terms of on Israel, look, no one's been tougher on Netanyahu. He's terrible on the protests. I totally agree with you, Jordan. And so, but among the contenders, Mark Kelly is way worse, right? And Mark Kelly was, the two top leading contenders were Josh Shapiro and Mark Kelly. No, don't dissuade them from Shapiro. Are you crazy? They're gonna pick Mark Kelly, they're not gonna pick Tim Walz. And then Mark Kelly's awful on Israel, he's awful on everything else. And one more thing, if you guys don't know it, Josh Shapiro was one of the attorney generals that led the fight against the Muslim ban. So yeah, what he said about the protesters was stupid. And the executive order he did in Pennsylvania was stupid. I'm not one of these people who are like, oh, if I'm supporting someone, I'm gonna tell you that it's all rainbows and flowers and amazing things. No, he's done some bad things, but he's also done terrific things and has the courage to take on donors. That's what I like, that's what I'm looking for, and is a strategic guy.
So you're saying it's not Shapiro versus Walz, but in a way it kind of is, because they're both being vetted. Of course, Kelly is being vetted as well. And Walz is clearly making the rounds in hopes of being selected. And there's energy behind him. And you and Anna have done many segments over the past several months, especially in the context of Biden losing support from people who are concerned about the war, Muslims or people who have family or connections or ties to Gaza or Palestinians or that region in places like Michigan could be a huge vulnerability in the election. So with this, they're already articulating this is a concern for them. I guess you're saying this is the progressive pick, but also like this is something that they're already telling you. Progressives are telling you this is making us very uneasy. So how do you square those two? Because you say in this piece, he is the progressive pick. How do you make that case over someone like Walz, who has many of these same accomplishments and many more? You mentioned Shapiro is cutting taxes for corporations. Walz raised them. Walz also raised the capital gains tax. Walz, and an issue that you like to bring up constantly, you did it tonight, you always talk about it, paid family leave. Walz did that. He could then go on the trail and say, hey, I did that in my state, let's do it nationally. Shapiro doesn't have that in his arsenal.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm sorry, I need to look it up here, but Walz has done a couple of things that are also, he cracked down on protesters during Black Lives Matter. There's a number of things he's done that's conservative, but I'm not arguing against Walz. It feels like this debate is about the versus A, right? Is Shapiro the progressive pick or a progressive pick? And by the way, I didn't put the title on the piece. Newsweek did that.
No, that's in the copy.
Okay.
That's in the copy. You wrote that. You said it's got to stop. Shapiro is the progressive pick.
Okay. You know what? If you want to get into the versus A, I hear you, brother, and I'm not saying that dismissively. So if you and if you say, hey, Cenk, you should have said a progressive pick or a really good progressive pick because that's being unfair to Tim Walz, I acknowledge it. Okay, because I got nothing but love for Tim Walz and all the conservative stuff he's done. They all do conservative stuff from time to time. They always do stuff that drives us crazy. The fact that Walz and Shapiro have also done really progressive things is amazing. Like, I almost never see it. So Jordan, okay, so that's the V versus A distinction. But on the other hand, do you see what I'm saying? That this guy is getting smeared as non-progressive, and that's not fair. There's so many things that he did that were progressive and took on donors that had an economically populist streak. And so, okay, on the protesters, he compared some of them to the KKK. I hate that. That's so dumb. That's why I say his optics are bad. On the the executive order, he said anything scandalous or despicable or some ridiculous term like that could get you fired if you're a state employee. Don't do that. That's against the First Amendment. And you know that they're going to do that if they think that someone is being critical of Israel. On the other hand, Jordan, he's critical of Israel. I don't know any other politician that has been as harsh against Netanyahu as Josh Shapiro has. But that doesn't count. I mean, remember October 7th, the next month in November, he's calling Netanyahu a terrible leader. I don't know that any Democratic politician had that courage.
Not in November. I mean, the squad outside of them. But if you want to talk about mainstream Democrats, very few. Chuck Schumer eventually got around to that point. You've had a few mainstream Democrats criticize Netanyahu once it became safe. That was early, yeah. But I don't think it's fair to say he is like no one's been tougher on Netanyahu because he still like takes the standard pro-Israel talking points. And he's conflated criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. So I just struggle to see the progressivism in some of this. And you've made the point, but let's talk about the other stuff too, because I think you bring up some other substantive issues. Let's talk about the donors. And there's one caveat with his like challenging power argument. One of the biggest pitfalls outside of this for progressives and especially for labor is school vouchers. And while there's not a direct donation, the AP did a story a while back on how he handled Jeffrey Yass, who for people unfamiliar is a billionaire in Pennsylvania and has outsized influence in Pennsylvania politics because of how he can throw money around. Jeffrey Yass has wanted school vouchers in Pennsylvania for a very long time. He spends millions each cycle. He can help dictate the outcome of races. But when it came to Shapiro running for governor, he didn't get involved. He didn't spend any money. And in fact, over the course of Shapiro's career, he's taken $135,000 from Jeffrey Yass's affiliated organizations. And sure, compared to the 90 million he's brought in over the total of his career, it's not a huge number, but it still is some, and that leads some people to think he did it at Yass's behest to keep him on the sidelines in that gubernatorial race because that's an issue that's key to Yass. And in the process, he upset the teachers' unions. We just talked last segment or 2 segments ago about Mark Kelly potentially being a VP pick and him just now signing on to the PRO Act. We got to keep unions happy. We want unions to be on our side, and they're expressing concern about a potential Shapiro pick. So it's not just that him versus Walz, in a comparison between those two, Walz is probably better. I just also don't see the progressivism outside of a couple other things, because you could make that case about a lot of Democrats. You could make that case about Kamala Harris and her time as AG. But then in the past week, you've also argued she's not a progressive and people should stop calling her a progressive. So I think for me, it's the label that you're assigning to Shapiro. Is he just a decent Democrat or is he the progressive pick?
Yeah, okay, but Jordan, part of the reason why I wrote this and what's driving me crazy is people pretending that Shapiro is somehow worse than the other Democrats. Mark Kelly, like they're not even objecting to Mark Kelly. Mark Kelly gave standing ovation after standing ovation to Benjamin Netanyahu like a couple of days ago. And we're having a conversation about how bad Shapiro is when he helped defeat the Muslim ban. He called Netanyahu one of the worst leaders in the world, and like a million months ago, and Mark Kelly sitting there kissing Netanyahu's ass, and we're now saying Shapiro's worse? That doesn't make any sense at all. So no, I'm not gonna agree to things that don't make sense. Kamala Harris, look, one of the things I'm worried about, Jordan, is that progressives are under some delusion that Shapiro's a bad guy and maybe because of those spectacular instances of him using the KKK language, etc., right? But that Kamala Harris is going to change our policy on Israel. She ain't going to change our policy on Israel, okay? So why are we going after Shapiro as if he's worse than Mark Kelly, Kamala Harris, etc., when he's actually shown an ability to criticize and to go after the Israeli government more than they have? So you're not saying that Kamala Harris and Mark Kelly and Andy Bashir are better on Israel than Josh Shapiro?
No, I'm saying they're the same because, as you've pointed out,
no, I would say they're not the same though, Jordan. Shapiro has
hasn't done
criticized
anything beyond just
Netanyahu
rhetoric.
significantly, whereas Mark Kelly's kissing his ass and giving him standing ovations. Kamala Harris hasn't barely said anything about Netanyahu or Israel.
Shapiro has in that situation, Shapiro has the benefit of not being in Congress and not even having a possibility of attending that speech. So we don't know what he would do. You might think he wouldn't stand up, he wouldn't applaud. I think it's fair. He's probably better than Mark Kelly, but I think I don't see much difference from where Kamala Harris is, other than that one line calling him a terrible leader, which also Chuck Schumer did. But it's just because he did it earlier doesn't mean there's any substance beyond the rhetoric. He hasn't called for a ceasefire. Tim Walz explicitly called for a ceasefire and not just a temporary pause like most Democrats did. When they had the primary in his state, in Minnesota, and they had an uncommitted movement, he celebrated the vote uncommitted movement, celebrated their engagement, said, hey, they're calling for something. They want change. They want to see change. And then said, I want a ceasefire and I want a lasting ceasefire, not just a 1 week or temporary pause. Josh Shapiro has not done that. So just by saying Netanyahu is bad is a very, very low bar to set. And when again, the framing that you establish in this piece is he is the progressive pick.
Yeah, look, it's not a low bar when in January, everybody's like scared to death of criticizing Netanyahu. Even Bernie hasn't called for a ceasefire yet. And he says, quote, I personally believe Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the worst leaders of all time. So, but no credit for that. No, same as Mark Kelly.
Sure, he can have credit for it, but but then what? He hasn't called for anything beyond that. He's just saying he's bad. Okay, good job.
Okay,
but then what? How do we fix it? He hasn't called for a solution. He hasn't called for a ceasefire.
And let's keep it real, Jordan. Let's keep it real. Do you think that it's more likely for someone like Josh Shapiro to fix Israel because he would have the credibility to be able to actually challenge Israel, or a random non-Jewish candidate who's going to come in and go, oh no, I'm going to defy AIPAC and every donor there is, and I'm going to make a stand on this, and I'm going to get called anti-Semitic, and I'm going to do all those things? No, we know Bernie Sanders is more credible when he criticizes Israel. Yeah, they even call him anti-Semitic, I get it, right? But he is more credible. And so Governor Shapiro would be a lot more credible and is more credible when he says Netanyahu is one of the worst leaders of all time. So he's much more likely to take action if they go in that direction.
But in your piece, you argue that it's probably not possible and it's not his fault because he's not in charge, Kamala Harris would be. So I don't know, what's the benefit of having him on the ticket then, just because he's Jewish?
No, I'm not saying put him on the ticket just because he's Jewish. I never play identity politics like that. I just don't want people playing identity politics in the reverse direction. Don't tell me that Mark Kelly is better than Shapiro. That's just saying I don't know politics. He's worse on Israel and he's worse on every other issue. So look, Jordan, you sensing what I'm saying? I'm worried. Why are people saying that Shapiro's worse than Kelly when that's just not true? I think people are taking a shortcut here, and it's a dangerous and bad shortcut, and I don't want them to take that. And show me Mark Kelly or Andy Bashir or any of them that took on giant Wall Street firms on behalf of the average American. I'll give you time.
I mean, we can go through Walz's resume. You won't want to bring him in. You don't want to make it about them.
But you're going back to the versus I got no problem with Walz. Walz is a lovely guy.
Well, you keep bringing up Mark Kelly. You want to compare him to Mark Kelly, but you don't want to compare him to Walz. So like, what's the framing here?
Okay, then let's see if we can get agreement on something. So we know who the contenders are. We're not going to get Raskin or Nina Turner or any of those folks, right? So among the contenders, if you say Shapiro's number 2 to Walz, I say, God bless your heart, brother. I got no problem with that, okay? So are you saying there's someone who would be better than Shapiro in taking on corporate power, being a progressive, among the contenders left other than Walz?
Other than Walz, I think it'd probably be similar with Bashir. I don't know like who would be 2, who would be 3. But I think people who are saying Kelly is somehow better than Shapiro shouldn't be taken seriously. That's just pure hyperbole. I also don't see that a lot. Maybe you've seen it more than I have. I don't think there's a huge amount of fanfare for Mark Kelly in general, maybe outside of Arizona or like hardline centrist establishment people. But again, this is about the progressive pick. This is the framing that you established in this piece. And on that point, I think if we want to compare, even if you want to throw Bashir in there, I don't know if he's necessarily progressive, but even among those
not
three,
at all progressive.
Okay, so let's take him out. So then for the progressive pick, I think the case can be made that Walz is a better progressive pick.
All right, so it sounds like we're agreeing that Shapiro is in the top 2. Wow. Yeah. Like we're supposed to hate the guy because he's in the top 2 of progressive contenders?
I never hated him.
Okay.
early on, I said he was probably a guy they should look at.
Yeah, and look, Jordan.
A couple weeks ago.
That's why this is funny, because we're arguing over, Walz and Shapiro, who we both kind of like, right? But the point of the piece isn't Shapiro is better than Walz. The point of the piece is Shapiro is far, far more progressive than people realize. He's got economic populist credentials, credibility. He's actually done it. He's taken on donors. He's taken on Wall Street. He's taken on the Muslim ban. He's taken on Netanyahu. And I don't want people to forget that in this fervor that's cooked up as if he's the most conservative. He is definitely not anywhere near the most conservative of the contenders. And even you acknowledge, I think, that he's in the top 2.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of cases to be made for him to be the top 2. But again, you said he's the progressive pick.
Here we go.
That's, but you wrote it. I didn't write it for you.
Okay, all right. Look, I acknowledge the versus a all the way back, I don't know, 20 minutes ago. So I hear you, brother. Jordan, thank you for doing it. I appreciate it, man.
Of course, anytime.
Yep. All right, guys, we got to run. Love you. Oh, make sure, ironically now, go attend my Abolish AIPAC conference that I'm doing. Okay, show them the QR code because that's tonight, and I'm going to be on there with Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Andre Carson, etc. Scan that QR code, and I'm going to close it out, and I'm going to explain how we can defeat AIPAC, and AIPAC is a lobby, and it has enormous power, but there is a way to defeat it, and the way you do it is through media. But I'll do that speech at that Abolish AIPAC talk. Thank you again, Jordan. Appreciate it. We'll see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.